Yeah, so this kick, for example, is not, it's not just one signal. It's going through the mixer. It's going through a bunch of mics that are routed to different outputs. So there's that mic, overhead, and those are all going into different groups, so you can process them differently, which helps a lot. And you can set here, you can set the pitch and the envelope of it and everything, and choose the kick depending on the kit. And the same goes for the snare. Also goes through a bunch of outs. It's breaking up. So, and then I've added a little bit of a drum machine. This actually, I think this one's free. It's just a simple kick with not too much processing to emphasize the kick on the kit. And then I've grouped them up in ways that I've basically separated the direct signals and the overhead signals. So the kick and snare, direct mics, and the synth go to one group. So that's the kick. Well, it sounds kind of roomy, but it's only the direct signals as far as I know. So here I mix. This is where I mix the acoustic kick with the electronic one. And this is not really a good example of a typical kick I would make with this. Would have more low end, but because I was aiming for like a kind of boomier kick, you can hear that the actual the synth kick hasn't really got any sub. It's just a pop. It's like it kind of goes from like 200 to 80 or something. So it's not really very weighty, but that was the point because it had to have subs underneath later. And also this kick is kind of, yeah, it's, the distribution is a bit weird, so you have to kind of work with what you want to accent in the kick, what you want to make more powerful. And also I haven't done a very surgical approach here. It's just kind of emphasizing it a little bit. You could go for, like, for example, completely high passing the acoustic kick and only using the low end from the synth kick, but I don't always like doing that because it loses a lot of it. You can hear it and it doesn't sound acoustic anymore, and I wanted this to sound like a break. And for the snare, it's kind of the same story. This is also got a little layer from a drum synth, but this is tiny. It's very small, but it's not, like, for example, here I didn't use a sine wave for the bottom end. For the fundamental, I used a triangle wave with an octave to make it a little more ringy, for example. The rest of the snare, right now I've just put some stuff on. I put like a high pass on it and an EQ, but turn off some.
This is just a direct signal, right?
Yeah, yeah. And then the overheads. This is the overhead signal. And the cool thing about, what's really, really cool about Superior Drummer is that in here, in the overhead, you can set what you want to go, how much you want the individual elements to go there. So something you wouldn't be able to do in real life. If you don't want the hi-hat to be, or don't want the snare to be in the overhead, you can pretty much take it out. Or I'm just using one. Let me solo this. Yeah. So now, this, I think, physically would be impossible to have this mic'd up and then have one mic not pick up the snare. So that's really useful for using, for example, if you really squash the overheads or distort them. If you have a hi-hat or a ride in there that you're playing, that will most likely give you really horrible distortion frequencies. So then you take that out or make it very quiet so you can blow up the kick and snare or toms or whatever. So that's very handy.
Yeah, blow up the toms.
And you can, yeah, there's lots of other little controls here. There's some basic plugins that you can use that I sometimes use, but I haven't this time. So then that overhead group, I group them up so I can kind of mix the overhead with the direct signal, because that's kind of also in later stages is important for the mix, how much stereo information you want of the drums in the mix. Yeah.
But this overhead signal has already been distorted as well, right? This is
Yeah, yeah.
a process signal.
Yeah.
It's not what.
Yeah,
what's coming
if
out
I
of
turn
the-
off the plugins on the overhead, it sounds like that. It's flamming. So that's distortion, some trash on the overheads, and some ozone. Think, well, yeah, lots of stuff. EQ, a little bit of reverb, not a lot. Some harmonic excitement, which makes a big difference. Some tube stuff. Compression, quite a lot of compression. A little bit of gating on the low mids, for example. So it all gets really flat. It sounds really flat. Some imaging, little boost of the stereo image, and yeah, some EQ. So that, and I haven't actually done anything to the group. Normally, what I would do if I do more synthetic style drums, take this group and sidechain, put a compressor on it and sidechain it with the dry signal, so the transient of the dry signal always cuts out the overhead, so the overhead comes in later, which makes it sound like cleaner and more powerful, but also more synthetic. So I haven't done that here. I could still do that, but I mean, these drums, for example, aren't really in any kind of finished stage, but what I would normally do is bounce out a lot of different versions, a lot of different sounds. Because the cool thing also about Superior Drummer is you can just change out the snare. You're like, well, you know, let's try this snare. And obviously you need to change your processing, and the tuning and everything is different, but it is really quite cool. Which one did I have?
The one above this.
Yeah? No, it wasn't this one. This sounds great.
So is layering with synthetic drums and tuning of drums something that you really pay attention to?
Yeah. And I like to try and not layer too much. Like try and get as much as you can from one sound, or at least have a sound that because sometimes a lot of layering is cool, but like when it comes to transients, I think you have to be careful. But then apart from that, you can do a lot of things. Like I've done like some drums I've made where I would have something like this, then I'd bounce this out, cut the break up so that the first you cut the first 30 milliseconds of the drum hit and put it on a different channel, and then put like some wacky crossfade and between the tail and the transient, and then you don't really process the transient too much, but you mess around with the tail loads, like distort it and widen it and whatever. So then you get a huge sound, but your transient's still kind of, intact. So that's something that works every now and again, but stereo image and stuff is quite easy to keep natural this way. You can mess this up, but if you just use these mics and all these sounds the way they kind of come out of Superior Drummer naturally, of course you're going to have kind of a natural stereo image, and that's a good place to start from.
Yeah, we generally use a lot of audio files in the projects, and then actually draw envelopes into the actual audio files and that kind of stuff, and separate the break and like have all the hi-hats on another channel again, even if the break was already sounding good, but it might not work well with the mix of your whatever kind of tune you're making. So yeah, there's usually a lot of bouncing and resampling going on, and then this break with that has already been separated into a couple of buses might actually be bounced and separated into a bunch of
different
again.
tracks. Yeah, within the project, you generally keep the kick and the snare on different tracks, obviously, and yeah. Now I've just made a group send channel for some reverb to put on the direct signal to do some reverb myself, so to speak, without using with muting the original overheads for a bit, I think. So, the cool thing about doing that on a separate channel is that you can control it, you can completely control it, so EQ it, and then for example do some mid-side EQing, which works kind of cool on, well actually it works better on mixed reverb and non-reverb signals, but I'm using it just on a reverb now, and I'm like splitting the mid here, and then I'm taking out all the mid signal. So you're only left with the side signal in that frequency area, which makes it sound a bit bigger. That's a kind of cool trick. And then you might add some distortion. See what that sounds like. Actually. So now it's distorting a little too much on the kick, so I'm going to try and pre-EQ it a bit. Well, for example, that sounds kind of alright in some ways, so then you mix that back in with the original signal. And then see how it sounds with all the other overheads. That's a bit cluttery, so then I'll probably try and clean up the overhead signal a bit before mixing it back in. Blah blah blah, and you know, do that for a long time because it's a lot of fun, I think. And then actually, when you actually end up using these drums in the track, you treat them much more like shit. You treat them much more like they're just a sample, which actually, it's better for your music, I think, if you do that. If you're not trying to be too precious. Right now, I can be super precious about everything, but then when you put it in a track and you're sequencing and you want to create ideas and you want to have a certain attitude in the music, you can't be too precious about it, because you stop making music and you'll just be engineering, or you'll just be like, oh, it has to, yeah. So this is the Mundus theme from the DMC soundtrack, and I think in here we have some, like for example, I think this snare is at least partially Superior Drummer. It's completely messed up, and then there's a kick channel, and that's not Superior Drummer, I think that's a drum synth. But these are all now just audio tracks, and just a collection of different sounds in there, which obviously already kind of made them sound decent, so then it's just a matter of putting it together. And yeah, this is just to create character with a bunch of layers, and now you don't have to worry about like distorting a bass drum or whatever, because that's all done. There's just reverb on this one, I think. For example, just this sound. If I turn off the plugins, yeah, it's just a. Oh, that sounds good.
Well, it's been EQ'd and
Yeah.
all of that to match the character of the.
Yeah.
Track.
Of the track and the space, because there's lots of space in the track, and so this is not a lot of work to put together like this. But if you look at the samples and you just consider them, oh, that's just a sample they imported, yeah. But if you look at the work that goes into each of those samples, then there's a lot of work involved. It just looks, this project looks extremely simple. It's not a lot of tracks at all. It's just a bunch of kicks, snares, blah blah blah, and some bass sounds that are also resampled.
Yeah,
For example, the main theme of Mundus revolves around this brass sound, and that's this sound basically, and that's also prepared, like made from I think, contact brass. So here in our samples, I can show you all the different samples I made before, because I knew I wanted to have a big brass stab, so I'll start messing around, blah blah blah, in contact with some horns, I think. And so these are all weird effects on it, kind of 80s. Let's jump,
It's
crisscross.
yeah.
So these then I've cut up and made this sort of riff out of. I'll just mute all these strings for a second.
And those are just, they come with contact, those brass samples.
Yeah, it was like an afternoon's work to make all those sounds and make them, because a lot of it doesn't sound very powerful. It's kind of weak. It's probably like a trombone or something. But so these other, like, now there's a reverse one, and those flanged or phase ones are in there. So this is now like a riff, and then there's all these strings and weird effect sounds. And some of them are from this or Contact as well. And this is all pretty basic. So this builds up to the drop, and then I wanted to have a bass sound that kind of reflected the same thing as the brass, but like with actual sub.
You don't fuck with a god.
So that sound, this is it's made in Razor, I think. Let's see what samples were there. This could all be completely random. Yeah, well, I don't know if it's there, but yeah, that sort of stuff you import and put some effects on it. There's some distortion and stuff, and then I've used this old resound with a reverb on it, and it's looping. It's actually looping a part, which gives it that old school Reese effect.
That's nice.
So there it goes. It's like affected. This is all done in audio.
Separated?
Yeah, you actually hear that it's completely degraded in quality. It sounds pretty horrible on its own, and you can hear in the crossfade that it starts phasing. But none of that stuff matters when you're actually making a song, because it comes across anyway. So there, it's like a different version of the sound. So a lot of mid taken out, probably. Yeah.
Because you make the samples out of context of the mix, do you find that you have to do quite extreme EQing to make things fit together?
Back in the day, probably more than now, but it's because of that way of working. What you do sometimes lack dynamics, and sometimes you have a really squashed bass sound that's just, like looks like that. But that's okay when it's bass. In a lot of cases, it's all right. But I think that is part of, for us anyways, also how we managed to get a decent sound out of a digital environment in the first place, because we were just messing with plugins and shit forever, and it constantly degrades shit in weird ways. So that creates a sound at some point, and I think that's a part of our sound, is a lot of processing in a way. It's just where you apply it. I mean, I wouldn't obviously distort a break horribly and then import that and try to mix it as a normal break, or try to get the transients to sound right after they've been completely distorted. Obviously, there's a lot of we have samples obviously that are clean and that you keep in mind that you want to mix it later so you don't squash it too much or you don't distort it too much. But this stuff wasn't going to be like a very nuanced track. This is all really in your face, so the preparation work and the samples were pretty hardcore as well. This isn't a dance floor mix. It has elements of a dance floor mix because it's got big sounds and it's got loud drums, but it's got much more space. And the space gets squashed a bit, and I think that's part of the sound of this track. But I don't think this mix down is very good or particularly interesting because of some technical stuff that we messed around with for a long time. I think it's actually, this is pretty crude. But there has been,
it serves its purpose.
Exactly. Every track is a completely different mix down as well, and I think we mix every track completely differently. We don't have a set way of doing it.
No, the only thing that is consistent, that is always there, is the limiter on the master.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, but I think back in the day we really sent shit in there really red, like really high levels, and now some tracks will have barely any limiting happening, and most of the stuff happening on the groups and shit.
Why do you think, what changed for you as you learned the routing process? Was that what changed?
Well, yeah, after a while, it's just, it doesn't always sound great to have the limiter constantly working. It doesn't. You know, sometimes you want more dynamics, and sometimes it actually sounds much better and also louder if you don't compress it too much. Because it's not, I mean, we're only talking about compression here. There's also the whole saturation part, you know, soft clipping and stuff on the master bus, which is also a very important part. A lot of these sounds already have distortions on them. There's lots of stuff already clipped or soft clipped or saturated or whatever, and we don't clip the master. We never clip the master because that just is scary. But we definitely use clipping or clipping-like ways of working to get stuff loud and to get it to sit in the mix well or whatever. But
we did it once, right? And then
yeah, we clipped one, but then that sounded really weird on different PAs. Like on some PAs it sounded great, and then on other PAs it sounded horrible.
So you want to generate harmonics by doing soft distortion and things like that?
Yeah.
Do you do that on the master, or is it within
No, well, there is a little bit of saturation on the master here, but that's not. Yeah, that's just a touch. I think it's more in the sounds already. But that's also what I like, because I don't like it if a whole mixdown is too colored by the master bus, because you want like a bass sound to be really dirty and full of harmonics and stuff. But then if your pad sound is starting to like distort in the mids or something because there's this really great saturation on the master, or that you don't want that, because you lose the impact, you lose the dynamics in sound color. So that's why it's great. Exactly. That's why it's great to have like really distorted bass sounds, and then have like some clean, semi-clean sounds or other sounds, and then have the master bus not really affect it.
And when you are making bass, I mean, in this track it's all audio already, but is it a plugin usually most of the time when you create it, synthesizing them?
The bass sounds?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a bunch of different synths, like FM8 and Massive.
Silent.
And Sylenth sometimes, and Synth 1. Yeah.
Do you usually use just develop a preset, or would you start from scratch?
Start from scratch most of the time. Like recently I discovered that Massive had these macro controls that are actually super useful. So because I was making these bass sounds for actually, I can play it quickly, which track it is. These sounds. This bass sound. So I wanted to have like a slowly escalating bass sound. So I started a Massive with a bunch of envelopes and basically connected all these parameters to one envelope that was slowly going up. But then it's really unflexible, because you can't really stop the envelope somewhere and be like, okay, how does it sound here? because you're constantly have to play back the whole sound, etc., etc. So then I thought, well, if I just do what anybody who's read any manual about Massive has done, just make a macro control and then put that on the mod wheel. So now, you know, then you can be like, okay, so how does it sound here? And set it somewhere, and then because it's so many parameters that are used that this controls, you can change one of them and then see how it affects the whole thing, and then you can make the movement in it later as well. You can just put
And add plugins.
and plugins, because this obviously sounds a bit shit.
The big difference is you don't have to wait for the envelope or the LFO to reach the point which you're tweaking. You can just set the mod wheel to that point and then tweak.
So is the modulation, or do you use LFOs more? Are you manually applying modulation?
Most of it is just from LFOs and stuff, but
Envelopes. So FMA has great envelopes.
yeah, something like that anyway. Well, FM8. Let me show you how. I think I might have a snare preset in there. It's gonna sound like ass, but it's should have. Oh no, it's actually the last time I made a snare in FM8, I made 3 different setups in FM8. I made one for the bottom skin, one for the top skin, and one for the one for the skin, one for the strings, and one for the kind of the crack.
Snare.
Yeah, the snares. Yeah. So yeah, and then I mix those. I guess I could see if this would be the bottom. So this is the bottom of the skin, and you just do stuff like make sure that it starts off axis, the oscillation, because if you hit it, I guess it won't. If you hit the skin, the oscillation, the normal sine wave that comes out of it, the fundamental wouldn't would start differently from its later oscillation. So it basically would kind of start off axis, not completely, but since we can make it start off axis, we will, because it gives it more of a snap. So then I use an oscillator that's set to a 0 ratio with an offset, and that modulates your fundamental frequency oscillator so that one starts off axis. So that's what I like doing as well. And for example, I can play you a bunch of samples I made recently with FM8 when I was making a snare. And you can hear that in the beginning, without any plugins, it sounds really quite shitty, and then later it starts sounding better. Like this is the basic setup of the bottom, the top, and the crack, and then add some plugins and some reverb, of course, because reverb is very, very important. And when you think of reverb, not necessarily the big reverb, but short reverbs, because hardly any drums will be recorded in a dead room. So there's always like a very short doubling of the sound that takes place. So if you're working with synth drums, one great way to make them sound better is to add touches of really short delay or reverb to them, because that's actually makes it sound much more natural. So here I'm kind of layering it, or not layering it up, but just doing processing, and it actually starts sounding, it's going on some tangents here, but it starts sounding like a decent snare.
Very disco.
Yeah, very disco, but that was the idea, to make a disco-y snare. So then, yeah, then somewhere halfway, I think I decided to pitch it differently. Because now, and yeah, this doesn't sound very good, but it's starting to sound decent. And here I'm adding like little layers. I think the little ringing you hear is actually a female vocal or something, just EQ'd using EQ to isolate some peaks and just mixing it in really quietly and making sure it kind of works stereo wise. So that kind of sounds like an overtone of the snare, but it's not. And then we're just going overboard with tails distorting, like reverb tails and stuff. So yeah, that I probably wouldn't really use that very quickly in a track, but I might use a tail or the and high pass it or fade it in or something.
So you've got all those stored, ready to access whenever you want,
Yeah.
label them, so
Yeah.
you can just go, oh, I remember that snare from 6 months ago that sounded like that.
Yeah. This is all FM8 stuff, like making some bass drums. And just going, I mean, I would never use this as a real bass drum, but you might use it for something. But some of the transients actually sound pretty decent. And then this has got a little bit of a layer on it, but it's just a nice drum and bass kind of kick. I guess it's because of the pattern. Yeah, so FM8 is really cool and stuff.
So it's just about layering different sine waves that are modulated differently for kicks when you're
Yeah,
using it.
yeah. The cool thing is you can just basically you can kind of think what happens when a bass drum is struck or when a snare is struck, and try to make that happen in because I don't know the actual math behind FM synthesis, how it exactly works, and I sure as shit don't know the math behind how it actually works when you hit a snare. But the cool thing is you can kind of get into it, and you, for example, you modulate you modulate the fundamental a bit more, obviously with another operator on the when it hits. To give it some overtones. That's anybody could think of doing that, just thinking about hitting a snare and what happens to the skin, you think, and you end up with pretty decent results. The only problem is with FM8 it's also really easy to make really shit sounds. It's because I think because FM synthesis is so delicate, kind of. Sometimes if you add like 1% to your modulation of another oscillator, the harmonics just go stupid and it just starts sounding like shit instantly, and it's not a gradual like subtractive synthesis or yeah. Yeah, so now I'll take just the kick. And I'll have the synth one here.
Maybe just blow it up a little bit, just.
And then when we change the phase, it starts sounding different. Just turn this up a bit so you can hear it better. But these also, it's triggering different versions of the. It's not triggering the same acoustic bass drum. It's like alternating, so that also changes the phase relationship, of course. But I think this one, for example, this kick has a 5.5 millisecond delay because I thought that sounded better. So when I'm layering it, I'm kind of now it sounds like there's a slight flam because there's that.
You got to change the polarity back first.
Yeah, I'm actually not getting a lot of. There is some. Yeah, this does sound better, but. So I'll generally, when I'm doing this and it hasn't been done yet, I'll just play it and just set it to like 1 and then listen and then change polarity. And also, what also works is you align it so that it sounds the weakest, and then flip the polarity. So you look for the shittest sound and then you flip the polarity of 1, because you know that it's been canceling each other out, so they must be almost, yeah, it will reinforce itself.
So yeah, what you probably did was set the delay first and then switch the polarity on the
yeah, no,
kick.
for every time I change the timing, I'll check the polarity.
But I mean, the polarity has been switched now all the time. So that was probably not the case when you.
Oh no, but this is the snare.
Is that the snare?
That's the snare that's polarity switched. But yeah, for this, it's not the best example because this kick is quite difficult. I think in terms of electronic bass drums, this is not an easy kick to mix. So also the effect of the synth kick isn't that huge, and I didn't want it to be either. So and it's a shame that you can't hear like very obvious differences when I change it, because there's not a very obvious alignment, I guess. So this was just a matter of working in details.
Do you work the same way with bass then to preserve its transients? Do you delay and switch polarity with?
Yeah, exactly. If I'd layer this with a sub, then the transient would be very important. You try to see where the peaks, where you get the peaks, you'd sidechain it or not. I mean, with a kick like this, I would probably sidechain it a little bit. But if the track has a really low sub, then you could maybe get away with just compressing it together a little bit. It depends, because it clearly has its own place in the mix. You could do with just reserving 100 hertz for this kick, and it would work itself into the mix. But if I'd have a bass and you want the bass to connect to the kick, then I would have a bass that has a pitch transient that actually goes from 150 or 200 down to wherever the sub fundamental will be, and then align that with the kick. So then you would sidechain it, and then you would try to make sure that the pitch transient of the kick connects to the pitch transient of the bass, and that involves a lot of milliseconds delays and phase alignment and stuff. And also the sidechaining has to be very precise, because the release of the sidechainer has to work with the tail of the kick.
So you calculate the release based on?
Yeah, when we had a spectrograph, you could basically see like a red line that goes down, and then if there's like a bump, if it's redder, then you flip the polarity and you'll see that there'll be a little dip, and then the red line continues. That means it's not aligned right. But that thing hasn't worked for ages, so I haven't done that, and just done it by ear basically. You could also just switch off the speakers and use the sub and see if it sounds okay. Because in the end, that's not all that important to get it exactly.
No,
it's a great place to start. It's a great reference, but it's not absolutely essential to get that all working the way. What I think is what I always try to do with mixing is just try to get the sounds and everything to sound as convincing as possible, and that's not necessarily a specific frequency range or a specific kind of dynamics or a specific whatever RMS level. Just to get the song sounding like it has to be that, and I guess that's also a lot of creative decisions along the way, and that's what I enjoy doing a lot, where the mixing becomes creative and where creative becomes mixing.